Hi, friends, folks. It's Monday, and I'm going to be starting another week of reading Pride and Prejudice. I hope you're all doing well. Today is Trans Day of Visibility, so I wanna say to all of the trans folks who watch my channel, I see you and I appreciate you, and I wish we were celebrating a Trans Day of Safety, um, where you would in fact be safe. Hopefully someday we will get there. Um, in the meantime, there's a link there to donate to Trans Lifeline for anyone who, like me, wants to show their care for trans people. Um, I had a weird weekend. I was in the hospital for a sleep study. Um, it was a planned thing, but it's still really weird to spend the night in a hospital. Hello, Alma. Hello, Jules. We're good to see you both again. So I'll be starting just a sec here, and we get to meet a new character coming soon that I know some of you are excited. Uh, I'm always excited when he comes. So, starting with chapter 12. In consequence of an agreement between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to her mother to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day. But Mrs. Bennet, who had calculated on her daughters remaining at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, which would exactly finish Jane's week, could not bring herself to receive them with pleasure before. Her answer, therefore, was not propitious, at least not to Elizabeth's wishes, for she was impatient to get home. Mrs. Bennet sent them word that they could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday, and in her postscript it was added that if Mr. Bingley and his sisters pressed them to stay longer, she could spare them very well. Against staying longer, however, Elizabeth was positively resolved, nor did she much expect it would be asked, and fearful, on the contrary, as being considered as intruding themselves needlessly long, she urged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately, and at length it was scheduled that their original design of leaving Netherfield that morning should be mentioned, and the request made. The communication excited many professions of concern, and enough was said of wishing them to stay at least till the following day to work on Jane, and until the morrow their going was deferred. Miss Bingley was then sorry that she had proposed the delay, for her jealousy and dislike of one sister much exceeded her affection of the other. The master of the house heard with real sorrow that they were to go so soon, and repeatedly tried to persuade Miss Bennet that it would not be safe for her, that she was not enough recovered, but Jane was firm where she felt herself to be right. To Mr. Darcy it was welcome intelligence. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley was uncivil to her, and more teasing than usual to himself. He wisely resolved to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should now escape him, nothing that could elevate her with the hope of influencing his felicity, sensible that if such an idea had been suggested, his behaviour during the last day must have material weight in confirming or crushing it. Steady to his purpose, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her through the whole of Saturday, and though they were at one time left by themselves for half an hour, he adhered most conscientiously to his book, and would not even look at her. On Sunday, after morning service, the separation, so agreeable to almost all, took place. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased at last very rapidly, as well as her affection for Jane, and when they parted, after assuring the latter of the pleasure it would always be to see her either at Longbourn or Netherfield, and embracing her most tenderly, she even took hands with the former, Elizabeth took leave of the whole party in the liveliest of spirits. They were not welcomed home very cordially by their mother. Mrs. Bennet wondered at their coming, and thought them very wrong to give so much trouble, and was sure Jane would have caught cold again. But their father, though very laconic in his expression of pleasure, was really very glad to see them. He had felt their importance in the family circle. The evening conversation, when they were all assembled, had lost much of its animation and almost all of its sense by the absence of Jane and Elizabeth. They found Mary, as usual, deep in study of thorough base and human nature, and had some new extracts to admire and some new observations of threadbare morality to listen to. Catherine and Lydia had information for them of a different sort. Much had been done, and much had been said in the regiment since the preceding Wednesday. Several of the officers had dined later with their uncle. A private had been flogged, and it had been actually hinted at that Colonel Foster was going to be married. Chapter 13. "I hope, my dear," said Mr. Bennet to his wife, as they were at breakfast for the next morning, "that you have ordered a good dinner tonight, for I have reason to expect an addition to our family party." "What do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody that is coming, I am sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in. And I hope my dinners are good enough for her. I do not believe she often sees such at home. The person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger." Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. "A gentleman and a stranger? Is it Mr. Bingley, I'm sure? Why, Jane, you never dropped a word of it, you sly thing. Well, I am sure I will be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley. But, good Lord, how unlucky! There's not a bit of fish to be had today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to Hill immediately." "It was not Mr. Bingley," said her husband. "It is a person whom I never saw in the whole course of my life." This roused a general astonishment, and he had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and 5 daughters at once. After amusing himself some time with their curiosity, he thus explained. "About a month ago I received a letter, and about a fortnight ago I answered it, for I thought it to be a case of some delicacy, and required early attention. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases." "Oh, my dear," cried his wife, "I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do not think it is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children. I am sure if I had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it." Jane and Elizabeth attempted to explain to her the nature of the entail. They had often attempted it before, but it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond reach of reason, and she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters in favour of a man whom nobody cared about. It is certainly a most iniquitous affair," said Mr. Bennet, "and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to his letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself." "No, that I shall not, and I think it very impertinent of him to write to you, and very hypocritical. I hate such false friends. Why could he not keep on quarrelling with you, as his father did before him? Why, indeed, does he have not some filial scruples on that head? You will hear. Hunsford, near West Ham, Kent, 15th of October. "Dear Sir, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honoured father has always given much uneasiness, and since I have had the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach. But for some time I was kept back by my doubts, fearing lest it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone with whom he pleased him to be at variance. There, Mrs. Bennet. My mind, however, is now made up on the subject. Having received ordination at Easter, I have been fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Lucas de Bourgh, whose bounty and beneficence has prepared me to a most valuable rectory of this parish, where I shall be my earnest endeavour to demean myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship, and be ready to perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England,
As a clergyman, there, moreover, I feel it is my duty to promote and establish the blessings of peace in all families within reach of my influence. And on those grounds I flatter myself that my present overtures of goodwill are highly commendable. And that the circumstance of my being next in the entail of Longbourn estate will be kindly overlooked on your side, and not lead you to reject the offered olive branch. I cannot be otherwise than concerned at being the means of injuring your most amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologize for it, as well as to assure you of my readiness to make them every possible amends. But this hereafter. If you should have no objection to receive me into your house, I propose the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family on Monday, November 18th, by 4 o'clock, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday se'nnight following, which I can do without any inconvenience, as Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence on a Sunday, provided that some other clergyman is engaged to the duty of the day. I remain, sir, with respectful compliments to your lady and daughters, your well-wisher and friend, William Collins. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennet, as he folded up the letter. He seems to be most conscientious and polite young man, upon my word, and I doubt not will prove a valuable acquaintance, especially if Lady Catherine should be so indulgent as to let him come to us again. There is some sense in what he says about the girls. However, if he is disposed to make them amends, I shall not be the person to discourage him. Though it is difficult, said Jane, to guess in what way he can mean to make us atonement he thinks our duty, the wish is certainly to his credit. Elizabeth was chiefly struck with the extraordinary deference for Lady Catherine, and his kind intention of christening, marrying, and burying her parishioners whenever it was required. He must be an oddity, I think, said she. I cannot make him out. There is something very pompous in his style, and what can he mean by apologizing for being next in the entail? We cannot suppose he would help it if he could. Can he be a sensible man, sir? No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter which promises well. I am impatient to see him. In point of composition, said Mary, his letter does not seem defective. The idea of the olive branch perhaps is not wholly new, yet I think it is well expressed. To Catherine and Lydia, neither the letter nor its writer were of any degree interesting. It was next to impossible that their cousin should come in a scarlet coat, and it was now some weeks since they had received pleasure from the society of a man in any other colour. As for their mother, Mr. Collins' letter had done away much of her ill will, and she was prepared to see him with a degree of composure which astonished her husband and daughters. Mr. Collins was punctual to his time, and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement nor inclined to be silent himself. He was tall, heavy-looking man of 25. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. He had not been long seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters. He said he had heard much of their beauty, but that, in this instance, fame had fallen short of the truth, and added that he did not doubt her seeing them in no time well disposed of in marriage. The gallantry was not much to the taste of his hearers, but Mrs. Bennet, who quarrelled with no compliments, answered most readily, "You are very kind, sir, I am very sure, and I wish with all my heart it may prove so, for else they will be destitute enough. Things are settled so oddly." "You allude, perhaps, to the entail of this estate?"
"Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair to my poor girls. You must confess, not that I mean to find fault with you, but for such things as I know are the chance in the world. There is no knowing how estates will go, how the states will go when once they become to be entailed."
I am very sensible, madam, of the hardship to my fair cousins, and could say much on the subject, but that I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitous. But I can assure the young ladies that I come prepared to admire them. At present I will say no more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted. He was interrupted by a summons to dinner, and the girls smiled on each other. They were not the only objects of Mr. Collins' admiration. The hall, the dining room, and all its furnishings were examined and praised, and his commendation of everything would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart, but for the mortifying supposition of his viewing it all as his own future property. The dinner, too, in its turn, was highly admired, and he begged to know which of his fair cousins the excellence of its cookery was owed. But here he was set right by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were well able to keep a good cook, and her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased her. In a softened tone, she declared herself not at all offended, but he continued to apologize for a quarter of an hour. I'm glad you like his voice. Okay, chapter 14. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all, but when the servants were withdrawn, he thought to have some conversation with his guest, and therefore started on a subject in which he expected him to shine, by observing that he was somewhat fortunate in his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and her attention to his wishes and consideration for his comfort appeared very remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent in his praise. The subject elevated him to more than usual solemnity of manner, and a most important aspect he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behaviour in a person of rank, such affability and condescension as he had experienced from Lady Catherine. She had been graciously pleased to approve both the discourses which he had already had the pleasure of preaching before her. She had also asked him to dine twice at Rosings, and had sent for him only the Saturday before to make a pool of quadrille in the evening. Lady Catherine was reckoned to be proud by many people he knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. She had always spoken to him as she would to any other gentleman. She made not the slightest objection to his joining in the party in the society of the neighbourhood, nor his leaving his parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even condescendingly to advise him to marry soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion, and had once paid him a visit in his humble parsonage, where she had perfectly approved of all alterations he had been making, and even vouchsafed to suggest him some herself. Some shelves in the closet. That is all very proper and civil, I am sure, said Mrs. Bennet. I dare say she is a very agreeable woman, and it is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir? The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence. I think you said she was a widow, sir. Has she any family? She has one daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and a very extensive property. Ah, cried Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head. Then she had better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome? She is the most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says, in point of true beauty, Mr. Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is in her that features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her from making the progress in her many accomplishments which she could otherwise have not failed to do. As I am informed by the lady who superintended her education, and she still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to drive to my humble abode in her little phaeton and bodies. Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court. Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her from being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, she has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed pleased with that idea, and you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer these little delicate compliments, which are always acceptable to the ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated of rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are the kind of little things which please her ladyship, and it is a sort of attention which I conceive myself particularly bound to pay. You judge very properly, said Mr. Bennet, and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are they a result of previous study? They chiefly arrive from what is pressing in the time, though sometimes I amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary circumstances. But I always wish to give them as unsteadied an air as possible. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and even an occasional glance at Elizabeth, except an occasional glance at Elizabeth requiring no partner in his pleasure. By tea-time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing-room again when the tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back and begged pardon, protesting that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Lydia gaped at his opening the volume, and before he had, with a very monotonous solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him. Do you know, Mamma, that Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard if he does, and if he does, Colonel Foster will hire him? My aunt told me herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town. Lydia was bid by her 2 eldest sisters to hold her tongue, but if Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, I have often observed how young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for how little interest young ladies are with books of a serious stamp, though written chiefly for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction. But I will no longer importune my young cousin. And then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as an antagonist at backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusement. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruption, and promised that it should not occur again, if he were to resume his book. But Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his young cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behaviour as a near affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet, and prepared for backgammon. That's today's 3 chapters. I hope you like my Jules, I gather you like my Mr. Collins voice. It's rather fun. So we will continue tomorrow with some more Pride and Prejudice. I hope you're all having a good day. Take care of each other, and